This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife Podcast as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. Here I am recording in June. We're having a beautiful day here in central Montana, and I hope it's beautiful where you are as well, or perhaps hopefully you're enjoying the weekend, which I'm doing some work here on Saturday. So again, glad to have you on board. Do take a few moments, if you would, and subscribe to our channel, and also visit us on Facebook in the Pest Geek Podcast area. Join the revolution, as Frank calls it. So we are going to have an opportunity there at Facebook to exchange ideas and to share and to talk, and so it's definitely a place where you can get some community, and so we want this podcast, of course, to be useful, and do welcome your comments and ideas for future podcasts. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you, because today's episode actually is a suggestion from one of our listeners, and so I'll just say, you know who you are. And so they wanted me to talk today about firearms and firearm laws. Well, let me be straight up with you. I am not an attorney, nor do I play an attorney on TV, okay, or on this podcast, but I was able to do a little bit of research on it to kind of give you some things to at least help you identify and how to find the laws in your particular area. Because again, with 50 states, and of course those of you listening in other countries, your laws are of course going to be different from the United States. The United States is typically known as sort of a gun culture, but even then, even with a quote-unquote gun culture, there's still a myriad of firearm laws within the country, particularly in terms of discharge, which is probably the biggest question for those of us in this industry. It's one thing, you have rules governing the possession of a firearm, and then you have issues regarding the discharge of a firearm. So it's complicated. So we want to try to use this as a way to introduce you into the complexity of firearm laws and regulations within the United States. So I have to talk rather broadly, and this will give you a start. So ultimately you're going to want to talk to perhaps an attorney or do your own research if you're looking to do some shooting. I can't emphasize this enough. Make sure all of your I's are dotted and all your T's are crossed when you're working with firearms within particularly city limits or places that are incorporated. I can't emphasize that enough. And then we'll talk about some social, cultural issues involved with firearms as well. All right, so enough of our introduction. Why don't we kind of get to it? So let's take a look here. We're going to start from the top and kind of work our way down from in this. So we're going to look at what are laws in terms of states. How would you find the laws in your states? And so navigating state laws can be confusing and complicated. It's written in rather technical language. However, I found this particular website, and it has analyzing air gun laws by state, all 50 states air gun laws. And you can do this at a website called, let me give a little plug for it, outdoorever/air-gun-laws-by-state/. So outdoorever.com has this particular page. I would just do a search analyzing gun laws by air gun laws by state, and it basically has links and some brief information and sometimes some links to the actual codes within your particular state. Now you say, why am I dealing with air rifles when I really mentioned firearms in the beginning? Well, that's a great thing to be thinking about, because how does your state define a firearm? Means a lot. So some places will define a firearm as anything that projects, that discharges an object under force. Yeah, you heard that right. So in other words, even if you have something that's, a little toy gun that shoots a little, what do I want to call it? A sponge, that can be considered a firearm. Because you're using air power to project it. Now, do I think a kid's going to be prosecuted? No, I don't. But you get the idea. It's written so broadly that it wants to cover every potentiality of anything that's discharged. So that means it doesn't have to have just gunpowder. It can be anything that has air pressurized water, pressurized liquid or whatever. Any of those things, anything that can project something out will be considered a firearm. So you have to find out if air rifles are considered a firearm or are they considered separately. Just because you read the word firearm, excuse me, I don't want you to think, oh, firearm, well, this is an air rifle, it doesn't count. You got to make sure you find the definition, because all of your statutes will have a section. Usually it's the first section. Let's say if they have a section that says statute 15, and then we'll have 15.1. 15.1 would be the definition section, or 15.2, depending what you're looking at. So you got to find out, and it says, it'll tell you what a firearm, for the purposes of this statute, firearm means. And it will tell you what a firearm means. You got to look that up. And it sometimes can be complicated because things may not, information in one statute doesn't always may correlate to information in another statute. So that's why there's lawsuits, right? Because sometimes legislatures don't write law that is consistent with other laws that they've created. And then it creates a conflict that the judge has to create. So you don't want to be involved in that. Do your research, but this is particularly one site that can help you get started. Would I rely on this, put my life on this website? The answer is no, I would not, but I would use it as a start of your research, because sometimes you'll have a link to a particular statute in your site. So make sure, let me bottom line this for you again, make sure you understand how your state defines a firearm. But there's more to it than that. You also have to find out how the local municipality defines a firearm. So your state may not have any laws governing, your state may not have any specific restrictions on the use of air rifles. However, your city or town may have restrictions on air rifles. So you can't just stop at the state level. Remember, in the United States, I can't speak for other countries here, we have federal laws, state laws, local laws, and then you have rules given to you by the owner of the property. You've got to check all of that. And you have to make sure that the liability insurance that you have for your business allows you to use firearms. So if you're not making a phone call to your insurance agent, wow, you are crazy. All right. So let me be clear. If you are discharging air rifles or firearm or traditional firearms that use powder, without talking to your insurance company to make sure that you're allowed to shoot guns, you are out of your living mind. Because if something bad happens, your insurance company may say, sorry, that wasn't part of your policy. You violated our policy, right? And you may be up the creek without a paddle, as they say. So you need to make some serious phone calls here. I do know that there is one insurance company. This is the one offered from the National Wildlife Control Operators Association. My understanding is that they allow their policy does cover does cover firearms or can cover firearms. So that, not a recommendation. I'm just simply telling you that that's one place you can look up. You have to be a member of NUCOA in order to participate in that insurance program, because but not every, just because you have a pest control insurance, you have to find out, they may think you're just spraying chemicals and not shooting guns, right? So don't just think to yourself, oh, it's just an air rifle. That may be treated as a firearm legally by your municipality, by your state. You've got to do some research in this area. All right. So sorry to break it to you, but that's something that you have to consider. All right. There's more. So let's go to the next web page that I have. Here we have the NRA. This is the NRAILA.org, NRAILA.org. And basically, this is a page that talks about the laws governing the transportation of firearms across state lines. This is going to be particularly important for those of you that live on state borders and your service area crosses state lines. Now here, so you may think, well, maybe I'm just going to throw a state out like Kentucky, and you may think, and Kentucky says, and I don't know this for a fact, I'm just trying to create a mythical illustration. What do we call it? Not even use the state names. Let me just say, I'm at state X, and state X says I can carry air rifles and shoot air rifles. They're not considered firearms. Okay? That's state X. But I travel across the border because I'm near a border state, and I cross the border and discharge my air rifle in state Y, and lo and behold, I'm in trouble because state Y treats air rifles as a firearm. So you got to make sure you figure out you got to make sure you know what those laws are, because transportation across state lines changes the rules, because once you're in a different jurisdiction, the rules are different. You can't just simply say, well, my home state allows me to do this. No, it doesn't matter. You're in someone else's house now. You've got to follow their particular rules. And understand there's two different questions here. You have the issue of the possession of a gun, and then you have the second issue of the discharge of a gun. So you may be in trouble at times by simply carrying the gun in the state. And even if you're not, the question may be if you're carrying the air rifle across state lines with it loaded. That may be a violation. So you can see how complex this is. The possession, the use, the ownership of it, the possession of it, the transportation of it, how it's transported, the discharge of it, any of those things you can run afoul of various laws or regulations. It's a mess. And so those people that are calling for some sort of standardization of moving guns across state lines, they have a point, because it's very difficult to try to keep transitioning across all of this. Okay. So make sure you find out not only what the rules are in your own state and what the rules are in your own service area and all the individual towns in your service area. You also have to consider if you're near a border state and you do services in other states, you've got to find out what the rules are there in their state and all the individual municipalities that are there as well. Yeah. So you have some work cut out. So let me just pause here for a moment. Are you charging enough? Now, I know what wildlife control operators do. They're like, screw that. I'm just going to plink this little bird. I'm inside of a building. No one will know. You might be right. Maybe you'll get away with it. But if something goes wrong, do you think your client is going to protect you? Is your insurance company on board? Just throwing it out there, folks. Yeah, this is why self-employment is not for everyone, because there's a lot of work to it, and the regulations can be very punitive and damaging to you. So this particular page from the NRA talks about the complexities of carrying a firearm across state lines. It talks about the federal law, talks about carrying a gun on your person, how you're transporting it in your vehicle, and if you're using commercial aircraft. That would probably be less of an issue for most of us, but some wildlife control operators do travel by air. They're specialists in this regard, and you've got to follow some firearm rules going on airplanes and stuff like this. It even talks about if you're doing work on national and state parks. So I know that's not a very commonplace. That would probably be handled typically by wildlife services. However, there may be times where wildlife services is not involved, and maybe you're going to be hired as a private contractor to go in there and do some of this stuff. Then you have jurisdictions with special rules. That's, whenever you hear the word special, that should tell you something to be nervous. Look at what we have here. Jurisdictions with special rules. And of course, it's all your leftist states, right? All your communist type states. And here they are: California, Hawaii, Massachusetts. I used to live in Massachusetts. New Jersey, New York, Washington, D.C., of course, Canada, and Mexico. And then you have United States residents returning. So the states, shouldn't be any surprise there. We're not talking about Alabama or Mississippi, right? We're talking here about California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, places that believe, I'm doing a little political here, but these states hate the Second Amendment. So shouldn't be any surprise there that they would be very difficult states to work in. So make sure you're following the law when you're working in these particular states, because some of these places will want to make an example out of you. Or certainly they could tie up a lot of your day. So a job you thought was only going to take an hour, maybe taking you days because of all the legal wrangling you got involved in because someone saw you shoot and they called the police, and then you have other issues there. So make sure you're careful when you're crossing state lines as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about municipalities. And so what I did was a little bit of a search about municipalities. I've done this here in Montana. This is where I live, and I would think, well, Montana is going to be a pretty loose state. We're still kind of a frontier state. We just got our second representative in this last census. We're now, I think, probably 1.3 million or so people. I mean, understand that many of you live in states where your major cities are over 1 million people, right? So we have 1.3 million people in the entire state, and we're the fourth or fifth largest state in land mass in the United States. We have a tribal area where this is where Native Americans are. One of the tribes we have in our state, their tribal area is larger than the state of Rhode Island. Okay, that kind of gives you an idea of just how massive Montana actually is. So we are a gun state extraordinaire. There are raffles for guns. Churches are giving away guns. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of firearms here in Montana. So let's take a look at Miles City. This is a city in southeast Montana. And, again, it's a city of 10,000 people. And not known for being, it's not like Bozeman or Helena or Missoula, which are very liberal cities by Montana standards. And look what they have here for their rules. I'm just using this as an illustration, okay? So notice how they define it. Firearms. How they define it. Whenever in this code, the word firearms shall include the following. And notice what it says. Any small arms weapon, including, but not limited to, that's the key word there, not limited to, rifle, shotgun, pistol, or revolver, which fires a projectile which is propelled by gunpowder. All right, fair enough, gunpowder. But then you have to look at the second definition. Any BB gun or pellet gun, with the exception of toy-type guns which shoot non-metallic projectiles at a velocity which is not great enough to penetrate human skin. So here they have an explicit exception for toys that are incapable of penetrating human skin. But all of your other BBs and pellet rifles are considered firearms within the city of Miles City, Montana. And this is not a unique state. I'm not telling you that this is not unusual. More and more cities across the country have this type of regulation. So even if the state doesn't have any rules governing air rifles, the city that you're working in may treat air rifles just like you were shooting an AK-47. It would be no different legally. It has the same legal restriction on it. Okay, so that's the definition of a firearm. Then it goes down to the discharge of firearms. It is unlawful for any person to willfully shoot or fire off a firearm within the limits of the city. There you go. That's right off the bat. And then it has other expressions. What are the violations for it? Punishments $500, perhaps 6 months in jail, and it goes on. Then it talks about carrying a weapon in a prohibited place. Dirk, dagger, firearm. Remember, air rifle. So if you're carrying an air rifle and you're working inside of a U.S. post office, the U.S. post offices don't allow weapons inside. So you're going to have to make sure you get the right exceptions to all this stuff. And let me be frank, you better get this stuff in writing. Don't just take someone's word for it. You better have it all in writing. You better dot your I's and cross your T's. And then it talks about carrying of firearms by minors. And that sort of thing there. So understand, this is just a small town, 10,000 people, Miles City, Montana. Okay. And then it talks about a little bit more about the offenses, how it's unlawful. Here's another section. Notice we had chapter 16 of this ordinance in Miles City, but then you go over to chapter 18. It talks about the unlawful discharge of firearms. It says no person shall shoot or discharge any bow and arrow, pistol, rifle, shotgun, or any type of firearm within the city, except when done in the lawful defense of person, property, family, or in the necessary enforcement of law by a duly authorized law personnel. This is basically so you can shoot someone in self-defense or to protect your property, but otherwise you're not going to be, and also to protect police officers so they're not violating the law of the area for discharging their firearm. Possession. Here we have 18-202. Possession says prohibit no person in the city shall have within his or her possession, except within his or her own domicile, or carry or use any air gun, BB gun, gas-operated gun, spring gun, or any instrument, toy, weapon commonly known as a pea shooter, slingshot, beanie, or any instrument made for the purpose of the throwing or projectiling missiles of any kinds by any means whatsoever, except those described in section 18-201. Whether such instrument is called by any such name, in other words, they're trying to get rid of people that try to get cute with names and stuff like that. You can't possess these items. You can say, well, how am I supposed to have it in my house? Well, this is what it says here. You can own these firearms and projectile shooting items unloaded in your vehicle, provided you're transporting it to a location outside the city where you're allowed to shoot. So even the mere possession of the gun, it has to be unloaded within the city, even if you're just traveling through it. Okay, you got to make sure. So you have to make sure you're following all of your rules here. And yeah, does it sound complicated? I would make like an Excel spreadsheet and create a chart. And then the problem is you have to find a way to make sure that if the regulation changes, you're somehow notified. I don't know how you're going to do that easily, other than maybe go on Google News and create some keywords so that you can get notified by email when that news clip comes out in the news. Or you just annually call the office and ask if there's any change, or you go online. A lot of these statutes, it's statutes at the state level, it'd be ordinances at the local level. A lot of that stuff's online now, and you just simply visit the page on a regular basis. Part of your annual review when you start the new year, are there any changes in the regulations? That would be the way to go. At least start the way, but then you hope that nothing got changed halfway through the year. So Yeah, it's hard, right? So this is difficult. This is difficult stuff. So I also visited another webpage about what are some of the penalties. What happens if you screw up and you do something wrong? What are some of the penalties involved here? So this particular website called criminaldefenselawyer.com has an interesting page here about the different types of crimes you can commit with your firearm. Okay. And there's a lot. So notice what it says here, the unlawful discharge of a weapon, and then it defines it. The unlawful discharge laws typically punish the unlawful firing of firearm, but they may also apply to other weapons such as crossbows, blowguns. Didn't even talk about blowguns here, right? Or BB guns, pellet rifles. These prohibit firing of any weapon within certain areas or under certain circumstances. We've certainly talked about that. Illegal use. Could be brandishing a firearm in a threatening manner. This is what people never want to be doing that. Okay. Firing a weapon within 100 yards of a school. Some of us get hired for school issues. Are you using a firearm there? There may be additional rules governing schools. Intentional neglect or careless discharge. Now, I hope that no wildlife control operator commits this problem. I would fully expect and be shocked if I heard a wildlife control operator being negligent in the discharge of their gun. You know, you got to make sure you know what your backstop is. Can you make the shot? Are you out of range? Do you have enough power? You're thinking about, is someone gonna cross through the line of fire here? You're not getting tunnel vision. You're looking around. You're seeing. You know the location. You have control of the situation. You know where that projectile can possibly go, and you have things sighted in properly. So this shouldn't be an issue. But if you're just simply, well, I have one bullet left, let me point it in the air and fire it off, that's a negligent use of a firearm. Okay? Or if you're just shooting it at the ground because you don't want to discharge your gun properly and that bounces up and hurts somebody or destroys property, that would be careless discharge of a firearm. The location and timing of your shooting, right? So many cities have restrictions that you're not allowed to shoot at all within the city limits or the town limits. And unless you're firing at a range or shooting gallery, which has a specific exemption for that particular location. Penalties. What are some of the penalties involved here? Well, you could get jail time. You could get fines. You could get both. You could get probation. And you could have firearms restrictions placed upon you. For example, federal firearms law prohibits any convicted felon from possessing a gun. So if you get convicted of any type of a felony, you've lost your ability to own firearms. So, yeah, does it sound complicated? Yes, it does. So let's try to summarize again what you need to do if you're going to be using firearms. Again, I'm treating firearms as anything that shoots a projectile or a missile, as they call it, capable of penetrating skin. You got to make sure you know what your state law is, what your local law is, if you're traveling to a different state, what the other states' laws are, and what their local laws are. So whatever your geographic area that you're working in, you've got to know what the state law is, and for every individual municipality within your service area, you've got to know what those rules are. And you then have to follow whatever rules are based at the particular location, because you may be working for a company that has its own policies. So we have statutes, we have what's it called? Policies. What's the word I'm looking for here? I'm sorry, I forgot the. We have statute, code, policies. So statute at the state level, code at the municipality level, policy at the individual business level. You got to follow all that, right? I'm assuming federally, none of you have a felony in your record and are prohibited from carrying a firearm. Okay, so then there's federal laws as well. Then you have to make sure you are looking at how you're transporting that gun, how you're discharging that firearm. Do you have permission to discharge that firearm? You want all of that in writing. And then, of course, you've also consulted your insurance company to make sure that you're covered if something goes wrong. So you're not just simply saying, oh, I have a pest control insurance. Well, does that pest control insurance cover firearms? Just like if you're spraying, if you're a regular B&G type PCO and you start getting into termites typically is a different rider on your insurance policy. Just because you have a pest control policy doesn't mean it covers termites, right? So termites often is a rider on that particular policy or a different policy altogether to encompass termites. Same way with firearms, right? You want to make sure that you're covered on that, okay? All right, that's the law. We haven't even talked about the social issues, and that is you have to be careful that even if you're following all of the laws, walking around with your air rifle or perhaps a gunpowder type rifle in public where people can see you can really elicit a lot of fear, because we've had a lot of people, unfortunately, there's a lot of anger in this country. A lot of people just take their frustrations out and start shooting up areas. And so people are very wired when they see a firearm. They're thinking there's going to be a mass shooting involved. You don't want to have police coming to your location thinking that they have a wandering shooter going around, because they're going to come packing and there could be an incident that's completely accidental. I'm going to encourage you to make sure you're discreet, that you're not just sort of walking around in sort of black attire, looking like you're a SWAT person or trying to do some sort of assassination. You want to be sure that the police are adequately notified, so that they're, particularly if you're working outdoors, I'm not so sure that has to take place indoors unless you don't have control over the people in there. If you don't have control over the people in there, then you probably want to notify the police, because someone may call the police. You want to notify the police in advance, and you want to notify the police when you arrive at the scene. You want to get names. You want to make sure that you have it, because police don't always communicate from one shift to another. So you need to make sure that whatever shift you're working under, that those people know what's happening, and so they're not coming in looking like they're ready to do some sort of Rambo type operation here. Okay, you don't want to be on that. It could be very, very dangerous when you have that kind of stress going on. You don't want any accidents with people getting shot. Be discreet. Think about your timing. Make sure you're following all the rules. Do your research. And I know it's expensive and I know it's hard, but this is what being in business is all about. This is one of the reasons why not everyone gets into business, because the paperwork can be a nightmare. You need to be sure you're compensated for that. So when you're doing these shooting jobs, it may be cool, it may be fun, but you need to make sure you're being compensated, because you've had to do a lot of research work behind it to make sure it's legal for you to do it. Because remember, and we haven't even talked about knowing your firearm, where that projectile is going, because once that bullet or pellet leaves that firearm, it's gone. You cannot get it back. So you better make sure you know what you're going to be hitting, because there's no redos, there's no reset button on this. Okay. Well, I certainly hope that was helpful for you today. Probably not the most uplifting or profitable podcast you have, but maybe it's profitable in the sense that I can save you a world of hurt down the road to make sure you have all your ducks in a row when you're dealing with firearms. I'm Stephen Vantassel, wildlife control consultant, and this is part of the Pest Geek podcast. We're glad to have you with us again. Take that opportunity to subscribe to the channel, join us on Facebook. We'd love to have you, and then drop me a line. Tell me what other topics you would like to have. Today's topic was a suggestion. I didn't think of it myself, and this was suggested by one of our listeners. Thank you very much. So I've checked it off, just letting people know that I do read my email. And again, it's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, or you can visit my website at wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. And again, this is the Living the Wildlife podcast. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife. not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.